All right, did you get through all the questions? Sometimes I think that what you should really do is host your table for drinks one night and go through these things. I think they'll be better over a glass of wine or something.
We figure we'll come to class so you'll add one more thing to it that we got.
Probably. So to just dive back into our timeline a little bit, I think last time we had to end very quickly going through some of this. So as the climate changes, you remember we talked about the Roman warm period. As it cools off, the immigrant, we would call them immigrant now, but the roving groups that were further north, the ethnic groups start moving south. Across the Alps, they invade Italy, they do those things. Those kind of things. The Vandals invade from Poland towards Spain and then into North Africa. That's the time of St. Benedict founding his first monastery. St. Benedict is probably one of the most important figures of Western history, and not so much because of the authority of the man himself. That's part of it, but mostly due to the monastic system that he established. The Rule of Benedict, if you were looking at a list of great books of Western civilization, is something that is of profound importance, maybe one of the most important books that have ever been written, because so many places adopted it, and so many monks, and all of this stuff through the Middle Ages. One of the things that they don't get credit for, and we won't get time to cover as much in our book, are the technological innovations that they made. With things like crop rotation and genetics, they bred honeybees, and they figured out a lot of winemaking. Like a huge part of the reason why vines grow on the hills next to river valleys is due to the monks sort of beating the ground for hundreds of years, figuring out where they grew best. And they discovered that they like drained soil on the sides of hills. So if you enjoy a glass of wine once in a while, you should probably thank the monks, because without their ideas and cultivation, it probably wouldn't have survived. And there's so many other things. That's one of the pieces in the modern world that they're finally getting much more credit for, that they bring actually a tremendous amount of technological innovation to their society. So that's the Rule of Benedict. If you were looking for something to read for Lent, this would be a great little book. It's not very long. Like, its impact is very outsized. It's not it's not hundreds of pages. It may be, I suspect it's less than 100 actually. And much of it is just about monastic governance. And yet, because there's so many people that followed it, because there's so many monasteries that adopt it, it becomes one of these most important documents for Western civilization. We mentioned a little bit about Justinian I. He deserves way more credit than he gets in the Western world. He is the one who built the Hagia Sophia, or had it built, the massive church in, at that time, Constantinople, now Istanbul. They built that, I think, in something like 20 years, which was an unheard of speed. And there's all kinds of things about it. He is exceptionally important in a lot of directions. I mentioned a little bit about 536. That starts a decade that is likely the most difficult in human history. If you were to make an argument about when things are really bad, this is it. There's a initial massive volcanic eruption that likely is larger than Mount St. Helens by several orders of magnitude. Like, many of you probably remember the Mount St. Helens eruption and the news that caused, and the ash fallout and different things. This would have been like, 100 or 1,000 times that. Not just like the side of a mountain comes down, but this volcano blew up so large that they don't even know which one it is. because the entire crater and like hillside or mountainside was disintegrated. Wherever it blew up, it went kaboom in a way that human history has not experienced since. So much so that it was probably like, it wouldn't surprise me, for instance, if you took all of the volcanic eruptions that have happened since this one and put them together, it was probably still bigger than that. It threw, they call it cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere and all kinds of things. Acid rain, the sun would be, if you remember in some of the fire years where the sky is that weird kind of hazy pinkish color, imagine something like that or even more significant for 18 months. The northern hemisphere seems to be hit extraordinarily hard, but it affected the whole globe. Summer temps fell by 4.5 degrees on average, and that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but I would compare it to the modern climate science where they're panicky about a rise of, I think it's 1 degree or 2, or 1.5 or something that they're very concerned about. So this was more than double that. It was catastrophic. Northern Europe went 2 years without a growing season. I mean, what would happen in our society today if we went 2 years without food production? You would have a lot of dead people, and it would make the summer riots at times of George Floyd look like they were picnics. I mean, it's a shock that as a society we are woefully underprepared for. If that happens, I'm not even sure what I could tell you other than we should move south. Because it would be bananas. So that volcano erupts around 536. There's 2 more that blow up in that decade that are also very large eruptions. They're not as big as this one, but they cause even more cooling. The people at the time refer to it as the year without bread. It got so bad that it didn't actually matter if you had money or not because there was literally no food to buy. And that, again, is a scary kind of time. The sky was hazy for years. People had no shadows at noon. The sun was not strong enough, even in places like Egypt or southern Italy, where you go to the beach to lay in the sun. It wasn't strong enough to cast a shadow. There was that much stuff in the atmosphere. And then it initiates a little ice age. So then glaciers start growing and precipitation and all those things. Crops start failing, all kinds of stuff happens. So there's widespread famine, and then it gets better. Because in the midst of this time, so you have one volcanic eruption in 536, I think the second one is several years later, 538 or 539, and then there's another one in 542. And then there's a plague. The first outbreak of the bubonic plague hits. It ravages the Byzantine Empire and many others by 541, and it lasts at least 8 years. The emperor himself gets the plague, but he actually survives. But it's something like 50% of the people alive in the world were dead by the end of that decade. It's a kind of catastrophic loss that we don't have words for. We don't have something, I mean, you can kind of talk about it, but to feel the societal impact, I mean, like, take COVID and multiply it by 1 million. You know, COVID, we had sort of all of the fear and none of the dead people. What if you have all of the fear and all of the dead people? So much so that in a lot of cases, they didn't even have the strength to bury the dead. They would just take bodies and they would burn them in massive piles. And part of it was because they were scared of disease. And it turns out that they were right, that the dead bodies could still transmit plague. So it's not talking about just a few people. This is widespread devastation. Like in some cases, you'd go to a city like Jamestown and you'd discover that even though you were there a few months ago, now there were like 10 people left, and everyone was dead. That's the kind of stuff that they went through. Oh, here I have it written down. So 539 is the second volcano. 547 is the third one. The people thought about it as hell on earth. I mean, some of the stories that they talk about are absolutely bone-chilling. If you read the accounts of it and what people went through. And again, I mean, imagine the modern world and all of the anxiety and panic, and then throw some TNT or some dynamite into it and blow it up a few times over. It would take all of that and just magnify it to the moon. I'm sure people had panic attacks and just kind of died from panic. And they didn't understand epidemiology and disease, and they didn't know what they could do. And the witch doctors and the, colloquial cures were all the rage. And this is part of what forces migrations. People move out of colder climates into warmer ones. And you could look at it as warlike or barbarians, but it may have actually been as much for survival as anything. This kind of thing would be challenging on a level like, I really hope it doesn't happen, because no one is prepared for this. If we have something like this happen, I'm not even, like I said, I'm not even sure what you could do. We wouldn't have enough time. If we had a massive solar flare that made a mess, or a giant volcano that blew up very suddenly and we didn't know about it, it would be a good time to come to church. That would be good, because I don't know. But one of the things that's really terrifying is religious people died too. It wasn't that God saved all of his people. The Christian empire was devastated as much of the rest of the world. So when you hear people talk about how the world is going badly and things are really poor in the modern world, it's okay to take it with a grain of salt or a pound or two. Because yes, it's not that things in the modern world are going well or that everything's on the right course, but some of that is fear, and some of that is a narrative, and some of it is just, we live in a society where this kind of trauma is nearly unimaginable. We whine and groan if the power goes out for a few hours and we can't watch our favorite TV show and can't make your cup of coffee. This would be, we can't even compare it. So yes, it was bad, and it could get really, really awful. I remember my dad and I were visiting as COVID was starting. For some reason, I actually remember where I was. I had called him, and I had gone out to the Walmart in North Grand Forks. They built one kind of out toward the air base. It was close to St. Michael's. And I was in the parking lot of Walmart, and we were talking about COVID and how bad things were getting. And my dad said, "Well, I don't really think it can get any worse." And my thought was, you have no imagination. I can imagine all kinds of worse. Thermonuclear war is worse. A plague that kills people like bubonic plague did. I think it's something like 40 or 50% death rate, and it took about 2 weeks, usually.
Father, so if the volcano and their nutrition, so the disease of the bubonic plague, part of that was because they were already malnutrition and, affected by toxins from the volcanoes and stuff.
Yeah.
So that was part of it.
Could some of the impact of the plague be because of the volcanic eruptions? I think you're probably right. I haven't really considered that. None of the sources that I have read talk about that yet, but there's probably some truth in it.
Is that where they killed cats because they didn't like them?
Well, they do start, in some places they go after animals. This is the kind of panic, for instance, that leads to stuff like the Salem witch trials, where someone starts a rumor that their neighbor was heard chanting something at night, and because of all the fear, just like wildfire, that turns into repression that turns into sort of breaking out and trying to clamp down on it. When people are afraid, things can get dramatically bad very, very quickly. So yeah, there certainly is some coincidence in that. It's possible that even half the people dying is an undercount. There aren't good records. Part of it is because so many record keepers died. I mean, like I said, it's not even. So there were places that probably had a few people get sick, and there's places that were massive cities and there's just a few people left standing. And it can do that in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. So yeah, I think you could look at, it would be interesting to know, for instance, the major bubonic plague that ravages Europe comes later in the Middle Ages. This one comes and then either it killed so many people or something, but it seems to die out. And then they go back to a more stable kind of thing for a while without a major kind of pandemic. And then it comes again, I think in the 800s or 900s. And it ravages Europe for the next, 3 or 4 centuries, something like that. But that's the time that people think about. If you looked up bubonic plague in history, you're going to get that European one most of the time. To find this one, you have to look up the plague of Justinian. That's how history calls it. To switch gears a little bit, canon law. This part, I think, in the interest of time, we're just going to kind of gloss over. Basically, the best thing to know is that the church's legal system, there is a legal document, and it's based on Roman law, not British law. So in the United States, our legal tradition comes out of the British common law tradition. Roman law was different. So in Roman law, the legislator, the author, legislates a set of principles that are then applied in individual situations. So the role of the judge is to take the principles that are laid down in the law and make an application of them to a particular place. So in Roman law, there's no legal precedent. It doesn't matter, because each case is reasoned from the same principles to a particular conclusion. So you lay out how something should work, you lay out the principles of understanding, and then in an individual case, you have someone who's given authority to take the law and apply it to a person. So it's a very different legal system. It means the entire code of canon law is less than 100 pages. It's not a long document. This thing that governs the entire church and basically explains how it all works is a very, very tiny document. It's very, very tersely worded. It's short. It's sweet. And it's a very different system. If you would look at the American legal code that describes even federal regulations or something, I was reading an article about this, and in 1970, I think it was 200 or 300,000 pages, and by 2017, it was 26 million. Or 35 million or something like that. And that's 35 million pages of single-space text. And that's not even the only governing document for the United States. So you look at legal cases, and in the United States we have precedent, legal precedent. So what the Supreme Court decides matters. Now the church has adopted a little bit of that, but it's a principle that's somewhat alien to Roman law, at least as a legal system. But it's a different way to do it. I'm not saying that it's better or worse. It's just different. It's a different kind of planet. So in the church's legal system, you always have a set of principles, and then you have a carve-out of authority who gets to apply them. So if you think of this is how the diocese works. The bishop is given a set of principles about how to govern and how to make decisions, and then he is supposed to take those principles and apply them to his particular situation. And so there's reasonable things, for instance, in ancient times, the Chrism Mass was always held on Holy Thursday. You held it in the morning on Holy Thursday, and then in the evening you would have the Mass of the Lord's Supper. Well, in a giant diocese like the Diocese of Fargo, where Botno is, 300 some miles away from Fargo, give or take? Like, it's just not practical to have the Chrism Mass on Holy Thursday, so it gets moved. And that's how the church's law is meant to work. That you have someone who looks at it and says, okay, this is what we're aiming at, but this isn't going to work for us, or this is unreasonable, we need to do this. We're going to make the best kind of thing that we can. And so, one of the challenges of it is that the system relies heavily on the person given authority to interpret the law. If they're a good person and they're after the kingdom of God, this works really well. It's wonderful. If they're a bad person and wicked, they could do all kinds of mean things. Because in the church's law, they have a lot more standing and a lot more power than like a civil mayor does in the United States right now. A civil mayor is bound by all kinds of things around him. And it's not that someone like a pastor or a bishop is completely above the law. It's not that. But it's just they have a much, much different role in interpretation than we do in our system. And so it's just a different sort of thing. It's part of the thing, like for instance, at a parish, in the law, the pastor functions as the parish. So there's committees like the Finance Council that advise the pastor. He's actually empowered, so he doesn't have to listen to them. Now, you could take that to a certain level, right? But one of the principles for the founding of the United States is that governance relies on the consent of the governed. If everyone decides that they're not going to put up with it, then it really doesn't matter what the law says, because the law is done. But there is, that's the way the law is written. Now, in our diocese and in many places, the bishop has tried to put some clamps on that so a pastor doesn't go completely off the rails and not listen to people around him that he has to advise him. But it has happened before, and usually to disastrous results. I mean, it's not good when priests do this. You can be a real big idiot in the church and cause lots of problems. And so, it's a little bit like the system of monarchy. If you have a really good monarch, if you have a virtuous monarch who is actually like intelligent and well-spoken and thinking and has good people around him, monarchy can be the best system of governance in the world, by far. The problem is, you don't always get good monarchs. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and history has taught us that almost all of them are bad in some way or another. On the other hand, democracy, like we have, you're supposed to have the right of the minority and the rule of the majority. We live in a system that's very much turning into the tyranny of the minority who try to impose things on everyone else, whether they're far right or far left. The small group of people, you could think of transgender ideology. It's really not that many people. It shouldn't be. And yet, to a certain extent, they've terrorized the entire country and forced social change for this really small group of people. That's not how democracy is supposed to work. In some cases, one of the big problems that we have is that we've also used it badly. Like, there were all kinds of countries in Latin America that if we would have let them have democracy, they would have elected communists. And so what did? We assassinated a whole bunch of people with the CIA. I mean, the United States record in Latin America is atrocious. I'm surprised that anyone wants to talk to us in the next 100 years. And that's even the stuff that's been declassified. You have to wonder how much more is there. But literally, in some cases, they didn't elect communists because we killed them all. It's really, really bananas. And in most cases, the people that we tried to put in instead committed genocide and killed millions of their own people. There's a lot of tragedy to go around. Suffice it to say that government is hard. And doing it well is even harder. But the church is based on Roman law, and you just have to understand that it's different. It's a different legal tradition. It works in a different legal framework than our law that we have. And both have benefits and both have challenges. It's in a way sort of like comparing apples to oranges. So sometimes people will ask, well, why doesn't the church do X? And it's like, well, you're trying to take something that fits in your framework and plop it into the churches, and it's actually running from a different framework. Now, you could argue we should change the framework. That's a fine argument to make. But at the very least, you have to then change the framework and not just try to pound your round pegs through square holes all the time. So, Augustine and his controversies. Augustine, you can make a decent argument. There could be a competition between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, but if you were to make an argument, you can in good faith propose that Augustine may be the smartest human person that has ever lived. At least in the area of theology. Reminds me a little bit, has anyone ever heard the story of Alan Turing? Alan Turing and Bletchley Park? If you want an adventure, Bletchley Park is the British code-breaking school, and Alan Turing has, in a way, one of the funniest and in a way one of the saddest stories of the modern world. So the British code-breaking school in World War II, the people that cracked the Enigma code, Alan Turing was one of the major mathematicians there. There's just funny things about him. They strictly enforced a dress code for basically everyone except him. So they were all dressed up in like Sunday best. He would often show up in pajamas with mismatched socks. He could barely ride a bicycle. And yet the man single-handedly basically invented a computer. As one person said, he can do that because he's doing math that the smartest people from Cambridge and Oxford are barely even thinking of. And he does it like pancakes in the morning for breakfast. You know, so it's like you couldn't ask him to cook you an egg, but if you asked him, you know, how to solve like fluid dynamics in the sun and their interaction with Earth's atmosphere, he'd spit it out like, you know, it was like that was an easy thing to do. That kind of person. Augustine is probably something like that. So many concepts and the ways that we think in the Western world were invented by him. Like the way that we conceive of the world changed because of this man. He is arguably the first one who wrote a biography. His Confessions is a book that's unique and singular in history up to that point. There's so many concepts that we owe to Augustine. And he is just this kind of towering figure that very few other ones even come close to. He writes, I forget how much he writes, how much we have of Augustine's work that is preserved, but it's in the millions of words. It takes a long time to write 1,000,000 words. Now, he probably doesn't do it all by hand. People like him would have had scribes around them they would dictate and they would write down in a kind of shorthand. Shorthand, as it used to be taught for people like secretaries and for meeting things, was not first invented in the United States in 1950. It was very much present years ago. And in fact, they were probably better at it than we are because they would use it a lot more often with people like Augustine. He writes on nearly everything. Science, history, philosophy, architecture, art, theology, redemption, everything. He writes in all kinds of different fields. He has foundational treatises on the understanding of the human will, how your will works, what that means, what it means to want something, what it means to desire something, when it's good, when it's bad. It's like he took an entire field and invented it. He writes about epistemology, which is the study of how we know things. He writes about the highest good and human nature, divine nature, the problem of evil, being of the world, the place of emotions and affections in the virtuous life, memory and time. One of the funniest things is you sort of read along. If you've ever read the Confessions, you'll encounter this. If you haven't read the Confessions, that would be another one of these sort of foundational works of Western civilization. But he'll just be sort of putzing along through his life, and you can follow it as a story, and then launch into this meditation on what time is. And you go from following him to being like, you're writing Greek. You're actually, like, this makes no sense at all. And then he'll flip back to his story like nothing happened. But, I mean, he has all of these sort of funny things, like what does present mean? And time is something that works until you think about it, and then it makes no sense at all. And the more you think about it, the less sense it makes. Because you can argue that it doesn't actually exist, that the only thing that exists is the past. Because what is the present moment? There isn't one. It's always changing, because as soon as you look at it, it's past, and everything that was in front of it is future. Well, where's the present? And the answer is, we don't know. If you miss your tax deadline, tell the IRS that. You can't charge me penalties because time doesn't exist. How do you know that? Well, St. Augustine said so. See if that works. I somehow get the impression that the IRS will not laugh. Augustine, now one of the kind of funny things about him too is that intelligence is a very odd thing. So you can argue that he is one of the greatest minds that have ever lived. And yet for the life of him, he seemed to be unable to learn Greek. It just didn't work in his brain the same way that Latin did. His Latin prose, when he's writing, he basically writes in poetry. He thinks in poetry. Like, stuff rhymes all the time, and there's word plays, and he does it naturally, like it just comes out of him. It's really, really crazy. It's hard to get good translations of his works because it's so hard to translate all his poetry. Like, he's playing with language even as he's thinking about things. And many great phrases, like, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. That's Augustine. There's all kinds of phrases that have made their way, and concepts even in the English language or that we have now, that are due to him. And one of the great things about Augustine is that he didn't just talk, he lived it. He lived in such a way that lended credibility to his message. He didn't talk about prayer and Jesus as if it was some abstract thing like a lot of people do. He was a man who was deeply in love. He was a man of tremendous passion. So he was born in a city called Tagaste or Tagaste or who knows what, somewhere. It's in modern-day Algeria near the Mediterranean coast. Educated for some time in Carthage. Carthage is near the city of Tunis in Tunisia. He has a son with a prostitute, names him Adeodatus, which means a gift of God. It's an odd name for a son coming out of that situation. His mother was a Christian, but Augustine wasn't baptized when he was